time is?
It is 6:09 p.m. and I'm calling the 21 December, December 21 March 2018 Election Commission meeting to order. Let's see, and I will call the roll. Vice President Viva Mohi.
Here.
Commissioner Jordanek.
Here.
Commissioner Young.
Here.
Commissioner Rowe is not present, and Commissioner Safant is also not present. Item 2, general public comment in advance of other agenda items.
Keep the time. Any comments? Would you like me to keep time?
That'd be great.
Okay.
Thanks. Seeing none, we'll go on to item 3. Open source voting, discussion and possible action regarding the City and County of San Francisco's open source voting project. Commissioner reports first. So any commissioner reports?
Yeah, I'll say a few things. For starters, I've been meeting with various officials about the budget season this year, and I've been meeting with a few other advocates, Alec Bash and Trent Lane from California Clean Money, and we've been basically, kind of educating people about the project and encouraging them to fund it this year. And also, Trent has been working to try to secure state funds for the project, and I'm sure he'll talk about that during public comment. And I've also, so some of the people I've met with are Jess Montellano in the mayor's office, who's the mayor's senior advisor. Supervisor Cohen, I met with one of her staffers today. I met with Senator Wiener and Assemblymember Chu about a month ago, and I met with let's see, I think that, I met with Matthias, who's the director of COIT. I've also spoken at a few different events. I spoke at a meeting of a group called, I believe it's called Unite America. They used to be called the Centrist Project, and to get them to endorse the project, and they're still deciding. And I'm also going to be speaking at an event next week that is, I think it's next Wednesday evening, an open source voting event. So I think that about covers it.
Great. Thank you. Commissioner Jordanek, anything to report? Other commissioners? No? Okay, seeing no further comment from the commissioners. The Technical Advisory Committee report. Want an update there?
Sure, thank you. I'm Tony Wasserman. I'm a member of the committee, and yes.
Speak up.
Okay, so we have been working as a committee now for about 8 months, and a lot of our work has been done in parallel to the work that was done by Slalom, and we just have seen the report within the last day or so, so I'm not going to make much comment there. But one of the things that we've been paying attention to, well, a couple of things. First of all is the whole way that a voting system works. There's some expertise in our committee about the various different aspects of voting and how to support the various kinds of special needs that people have. Most of us on the committee are experienced with, or at least fans of, agile development processes. And so one of the things that we spent a fair amount of time looking at is how do we do things, one step after the other. What would we recommend to the team that wins the contract in terms of how to go about things? And I noticed, at least in passing, as I flipped through the Slalom report, that they too had proposed some order to things rather than trying to do everything at once. The letter that we sent to the commission that is dated the 19th, in addition, talks about the initial project funding, and it's based on this notion of release early, release often, where you have a sequence of releases, and the things that you put out first are intended to have the, if you will, the biggest bang for the buck. So when we talked about doing the vote by mail piece as a first as the first thing, because it addresses the most people and has the least hardware requirements or capital expenses. But the letter talks about also the need to have project management. So the project has to be funded, of course, and we hope that the upcoming budget will support that. But we also think that it needs oversight by somebody who has experience in managing substantial procurements, and ideally things that involve open source software and agile development, agile process delivery. So those people are in huge demand here in the world at large, but particularly here in the Bay Area. So you know, we encourage the commission and the city to you know, try hard to find such a person and to compensate that person at a level that will attract the kind of people that we think are needed to carry out the oversight of the project with the winning bidder. Let me, maybe I should stop there and be glad to answer questions that people may have in more detail. Thank you.
This is President Donaldson. I just was wondering about the Slalom report, of course, has just come out. However, I was wondering if there's any preliminary findings regarding the relationship of what tax. Are you in concurrence, difference?
So let me preface my remarks by saying that I have not had time to read the report thoroughly. It's over 60 pages, and there are a lot of details in there and matrices, and I mean, there's a lot of work that went into that over some number of months. So I don't want to give it short shrift. But there are a couple of things in there that I particularly noted. One was that they spent a lot of time addressing governance of the project post availability, and I think that's an important thing to have included there, because I don't know of any city that has really taken on a project like this and tried to manage a community in addition to managing the project itself. And so I was glad to see that they had addressed that. I also liked the fact that they did identify some of the key issues that need to be addressed, some of which will come from this mission and others from other parts of the city government. I also liked that they had gotten out of the building in a sense. They had gone out and talked to a lot of stakeholders with different interests about this project, and recognized that given the heightened interest in elections in general these days, that there's going to be a need for substantial buy-in, public support. So those are things that I saw just on a first pass through the report that struck me as positives. I hope at some point in the near future to be able to devote more time to it, but that's at least first impression.
Thank you. Other questions for Mr. Wasserman? Commissioners? No? Thank you very much
Well, thank you.
for the update. Okay, and third, Director's report on open source.
All right. Since the Slaloms issued the business case, I provided to several folks in the city. The city's Committee on Information Technology, COIP, was one of the stakeholders with whom Solomon met, and I had interaction. But I contacted COIP to get a sense of what the process would be in relation, not so much to the business case, but to what any next steps would need to occur in relation to developing a voting system, but also with reference to the business case. So my understanding at this point is that the Department of Elections will need to submit an application to COIT to get COIT to consider a recommendation of funding, essentially, or to fund any development work on an open source voting system. So I'll look at that. I've looked at the application already. I'll get a sense of more. I've also been contacted or been in discussion with the city's director of the Department of Technology, and she indicated she'll also assist me with inputting information in the application to submit to COIT, so COIT can consider the application for a recommendation. I also sent the business case to the city's risk management office because there was some items in the business case regarding possible risks that the city might undertake if they were to develop a voting system. So I meet with risk management tomorrow, actually. Not so much to talk about the business case, probably somewhat be a combination of business case, also a risk analysis based on the risk manager's assessment. Then also I got the letter from TAC, from Commissioner Jordanic, and what I think the starting point for the application to COIT will be the TAC recommendations for the components to start with development. And so there was the four. There was the results reporting, the central tabulation. What was the other one?
Central scanning.
Ballot tabulation and central scanning, ballot auditing and batch management, and ballot layout. So I haven't really looked at the application to know if I can include all those in an application, but I'll look. If I can, I will. But certainly with the result reporting application, that would certainly be I think a good starting point for an application for COIT's consideration. Then also on the matter of the licensing, there was reference in the business case on the city determining what sort of license to apply to the system. So I did put the initial question to the city attorney's office. I also spoke with Commissioner Jordanic yesterday for a few hours on the business case and also on steps to develop the system. So Commissioner Jordanic sent me some information regarding warranties on other open source applications or programs. Licenses. And so I forwarded that to the city attorney's office. I forgot to send that to risk management, but I'll do that tonight before I go, so they have that information prior to our meeting tomorrow. So the next step really is we have to get an application developed and then get that into COIT and then have COIT start its process. So.
And in terms of that application, you mentioned like first results reporting, you thought, so it actually needs to be tied to a specific deliverable. Is there some standard for this application process?
Yes.
I mean, it's...
Yeah, and I'll probably have to rely more on the director of the Department of Technology's wisdom on what to put in the application. I can do more of the business side of it, what potentially the outputs would be from the application, but as far as any technical standards or for COIT to consider, that's something probably I'll have to rely on the director.
And then, so just a quick question. So when you say the application, it says, and then I'm hearing a lot of words of like the funds that should be allocated or requesting for COIT to get funding. Is there a dollar amount that was already discussed. I might have missed that, so.
Well,
I think, is that in the recommendation?
Yeah, can I say something about
Yeah,
that? So,
okay.
So, I mean, one of the things I'd like to do before this agenda item is over is for the commission to, I'd like to introduce a motion that we basically support the department's request, something similar to what we did last year. Last year we did request, or indicated support for a certain dollar amount.
Mhm.
And I was thinking that we could basically support the recommendations coming out of TAC, and then, communicate that to the mayor's office in Coit, in addition to the department doing so, and then also just kind of reiterate our request for a minimum dollar amount.
Mm.
And then that would kind of feed into the Slalom's report, and then that can be kind of used for that. But I think it's obvious that we're not going to be able to fund the whole thing in the first year, so we're just going to get started. That's the idea.
Okay. Questions, commissioners, other questions for Director Arns?
Can I say something? I think, are you going to give Slalom an opportunity to answer questions about the report next?
Oh, Solomon's here, yes. Absolutely, I think this would be a good time to do that. So, we have somebody from Slalom present who would like to speak? Any?
I'm sorry. So Slalom, they don't have a presentation about the business case
Okay.
so much, but
Got it.
but they can answer any questions from the commission.
Got it.
regarding the business
Got it.
Yeah, so I could start off with some questions. For starters, I just want to thank all of you for the extraordinary work you did. I know you've been working very hard over these past several months, and I had a chance to meet with you on more than one occasion, and I had a chance to give you feedback on the work that you've been doing. So just want to say thank you. And I'm sure it's been a good learning experience for all of you too. So I mean, obviously, we're not going to have time to kind of thoroughly get into the full report, but I did want to kind of, ask, just some the sort of the higher level questions about it. And so, for starters, I think I know the answer to this question, but just so people are clear, did you do a comparison of how much it would cost to develop and use an open source system compared with a proprietary system, or did you just estimate the cost of an open source kind of on its own?
Thank you for the question. Yeah, so to answer that directly, we did not do a comparison of an open source project or program versus a proprietary non-open source or closed source solution.
Introduce himself first.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Do you mind introducing yourself first?
Oh, sorry, sure. I'm James Cunningham from Slalom Consulting. I'm the project lead for this engagement. And I want to also echo the thanks and say very grateful for the opportunity to work on this vital part of the city's technology and the processes that they have to serve, the services they provide to their constituents. I brought with me the technical lead and the one of our managing directors who's been overseeing the engagement as well. So I'll let you do that.
So my name is Andrew Barrett. As James said, my responsibility was more of the technical aspects of what was going on here. So how would technology affect the process, right? What decisions might need to be made, things like agile and delivery timelines and costing and so forth.
And John Pavel, Managing Director of Slalom, and responsible for the whole project here. So thanks for doing this.
I do have a question. Is y'all okay?
Sure.
So I haven't had a chance to look through the document. I admit, other than the few minutes that I've spent perusing it here, I don't immediately see an executive summary. Would the feasibility summary, is that kind of does that serve that role on page 6?
Yeah, at the beginning of the document, as it reads, we tried to bring up the most salient points around the key assumptions, and then really drill into the big risk items and the decisions that the city would need to take based on those risk items.
Okay.
So
Well,
this,
and if I could just ask, this 65-page document, what's your conclusion?
what's our conclusion? So the report's goal was to support policy making and budgeting. Right? It wasn't to be definitive of a recommendation of whether to do this project or not. It was to lay out, gather whatever available information we could find, and dig in where we had to discover new information and put that together in a way that would support policy and budgeting. So, there was no intent to provide a recommendation in that respect. The overall narrative of the report, I hope, conveys that there is a number of fairly significant risks that would need to be reviewed and evaluated, and understand what the city's appetite is for those risks. So, as listed, in the full set here, for example, how the uncertainty around how the Secretary of State would approve the iterative nature of incremental development of technology and incremental product, how that approval process would work. That's a very unknown entity because it hasn't happened, there's no precedent for it yet. So that is an example of a type of risk that is fairly significant and needs to be explored. Decisions need to be made, or further understanding of how the relationship with the Secretary of State would happen. So there's sort of, I think, about a dozen of those critical risk items, and the report really is that you can understand those risks, review those risks, look at the decisions that need to be made on those. That's, I guess, where you would be able to determine your own answer. Am I answering your question? I don't know if I got.
Maybe. I mean, I hear the answer. I hear the answer that the narrative of the report describes significant risks that need to be reviewed and evaluated. Is that kind of the summary?
Yes, because this, to Chris's, to Commissioner John's point, an evaluation of this versus the current state and the costs associated with that also needs to be done. That's a risk that's identified there. So there's a number of steps to take from this point to be able to determine what that policy and what the budget should be for.
Okay, well, let me ask the question in a slightly different way. So there are risks to every project, and every new project and every development that a government undertakes has risks that need to be weighed. So let's assume for a moment that it's the policy of this commission that the city develop an open source voting system, which it is, and that the city wishes to develop it. In your mind, how would we get it done? How do we get from here to there?
Sure. So I think that, 65 pages, there's a lot of things obviously there to review. If you look at that first section that has those key risks in it, that should highlight the things that will help you determine whether it is appropriate to do or not. And those are things that you will have to weigh and evaluate based on your level of appetite to take on certain risks. As we were talking about State of California. State of California, there's a lot of things that are unknown about the certification process today because no one has undertaken this process with State of California. That being the case, there's a lot of uncertainty there. So the city has to look at that and a number of other items and say, if we were to go this direction and custom build it as an open source solution, are we comfortable? Can we mitigate that risk to a point that we're comfortable moving forward with that? And then has to evaluate it, which was out of scope of what we're doing, with a current solution that you have in place or another vendor solution that isn't an open source solution, and be able to say, this provides our best path forward. So our goal in this process was not to say you should do this, but to identify the risks that need to be considered, and then let the city be able to say, okay, if we weigh this risk in this way, and we're comfortable with that amount of risk in this place, here's the things that we need to do to be able to make the decision for ourselves to say, yes, we should do it, or we should accomplish this goal not through an open source voting system that we custom develop ourselves, but through a partnership with another city like LA County or some other solution, a non-open source solution.
I have not read the report thoroughly either, but I would like to ask if you went into any depth as to why Travis County was unable to find vendors that were interested.
I can tell you what we found out. That was basically the way they had tendered, you put the RFP together to attract vendors. The elements of a voting system that were individually, or a request for proposal was launched for, they didn't get a response for the entire system, specifically on the kind of core elements of a voting system. So because no vendor was willing to share their proprietary information and release and have that as a open source product, they were unable to get an entire solution. So they have to reconsider how they're going to achieve getting a new voting system. That is what we were able to gather through our study. Anything else to add?
Yeah, they basically wrote their RFP that if there was 10 components to a system, it was all or nothing. Someone had to bid on everything and agree to do it all, and they couldn't find a vendor who was willing to take on all. They found vendors who were willing to take on, let's say, 6 or 7, but they couldn't find someone to take on everything. And so because of that, they stopped the process.
Yes, and the EMS, the election management system, I think got no response.
And can I just back up here for a second?
Sure.
So we were talking about some of the, I asked for a conclusion, and then we talked about, you all referenced section 2.1 key risks and mitigation actions. And the example that you gave in particular was 2.1.5 certification of the system with the Secretary of State. But I know, I understand the scope of the ask here with respect to this report, but if I were addressing a policymaker who wanted to get this done, what's the mitigation action for the certification of the system with respect to this Secretary of State? You said from your initial conversation with the Secretary of State, they are open to this nimbler approach, and you said the city should conduct a discovery phase, interaction model, negotiated with the Secretary of State. Have you formed a conclusion as to if you were kind of explaining this in ordinary words to a politician on how to get this done, what would be the mitigation? In other words, what would be the way to get this done within the constraints that we have? So is it does this boil down to get Secretary of State on board, get him to agree to a nimbler approach, and if so, any thoughts on?
I mean, that is the outcome you'll want. It's a question of what's the vehicle to make that happen. I think there were some discussions about obtaining a memorandum of understanding between the development team or development body and the Secretary of State to kind of reduce the risk, because it's uncertain. So what can we get in writing around the way we would interact in this more agile product methodology? So if they could commit to certain timelines around review of features that get created, getting kind of the service level agreements, if you will, between the development team and them. That would be a more an idea, like a tangible way of getting that done. But your outcome is, how do you make sure that the way we're going to work with them is understood and is de-risked? They can't just say, well, you have a timeline, you have an election coming up, that's happening. So how do we commit to reviewing a system after bug fixes have been applied? What's the correct turnaround time? When do we freeze, additional development of the system? So it's getting that kind of methodology of like how an item gets through deployment, gets reviewed, gets certified, and their role in that process. Because we explored it with them and they were open to the idea, but I don't think that's enough. I think you want to get a bit more certainty on how the interaction with them will actually work step by step and what they can commit to.
Okay, and let me just ask one more question, try it one more time. So 1.1 says, purpose of this document is to inform the city of the feasibility of its options to create a highly accessible open source voting system and the costs and timeframes associated with the options. Were you able to conclude whether it is feasible for the city to create a highly accessible open source voting system?
I believe that the phrase is anything is feasible with enough time and money, right? So, we wrestled with that question of like, how do you define feasibility? We broke out, a number of factors to derive that, but it's not a conclusive like yes or no, because unfortunately the answer is it's going to depend on the appetite of the risks that we've laid out. It's not a simple, I don't believe this to be a simple red light, green light discussion. We try to lay out the risks for this project, but also the ways that you can mitigate those risks or make decisions about how you want to handle those risks. And we weren't going to also make jump to a conclusion about how the city might react to those risks. There's a whole department for risk and risk management. We can't opine on that. So it is, a tough answer, but it is like, it depends. And personally, I get frustrated with that answer, but we were able to show which option, which sort of approach, based on our framework of prioritization, made the most sense. So which option would be maybe the least risky, the balance of risk, time, and cost, to be able to kind of inform the types of choices you can make. So it can eliminate perhaps certain options because they're either going to cost you a lot more, going to take a lot longer, or be a lot riskier. So definitely it was feasibility of options.
Okay. Thanks. Sergio? Okay. I wanted to just revisit because I did a little more looking through here, and maybe I missed some things, but I was looking at the key risks and mitigation actions, section 2.1, which is the summary, and I just, I don't, it sounds like one of the things learned from Travis County was that perhaps their approach to actually trying to contract was too comprehensive at a time. It sounds like Director Orange is already having the approach, or thinking about an approach of building out components. Is that someplace else in I'm just thinking about others reading this document about how we go about doing that, and I don't see that here in the risk mitigation factors as a summary of like an approach that would address some of the things that did not go well in Travis County.
Just to confirm,
and maybe I missed it.
2.1.3, that doesn't address, does that address the question?
Yeah, I didn't see I see the commit to a discovery phase, certainly, but I think that the other thing was that some more specifics, because I see you went into some specifics about LA County. I just didn't find the same for Travis County. So I guess for the record here, anyways, I just want to acknowledge that, and thank you for the information, but I didn't see that specifically in the report.
Yeah, no additional information about Travis County was discovered by the project team during the course of the project.
Okay.
Yeah, there were some things put in there that are derived from the conversation that we had about Travis County and what we learned from them. Part of the speed to value section where we talk about doing it iteratively and breaking it into logical parts is in part that, right? Because if you think about, if you're going to execute in that way, you're probably going to do procurement in that way as well. So you wouldn't be looking at build me an entire end-to-end system in a single RFP, or even proposing all of the RFP at one particular time. So by staging it and thinking of it iteratively with Agile and with some of the ways that we're grouping functionality, that mitigates some of the things that we saw with Travis County, which was they said give me everything or give me nothing, and they got nothing.
So there's some presupposition there, and that Travis County was sort of the evidence of not having done that sort of an approach. I see.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Jurdonic?
Yeah, so I've got several more questions. So my first question was about, whether you did a cost comparison of open source versus proprietary, and the reason I ask this is kind of more for other people's benefits, but there are a number of dollar figures in this document, and so a lot of these dollar figures would kind of be the same whether it's open source or proprietary. Like, for example, there's a line here for paper ballot costs for $1.4 million that's going to be present whether or not it's open source. There's a line for poll worker training that's going to be there for whether or not it's open source. And there's a line $1 to $2 million for hardware storage, so that's going to be there for whether or not it's open source. So if you see like a large dollar amount, it doesn't mean that all of that is just for the open source system. So I want people to be aware of that. But so my next question is around, it's kind of one of the things I'd have to say may be a little disappointed in was that one of the principles that we support in our resolution was that this project be more agile, and so the city allocated this $175,000 for this planning phase, but then one of your recommendations is to have another planning phase costing a little bit over $1 million that you're calling the discovery phase. And just kind of as an example, on page 10, you say part of this is to conduct an assessment and comparison of alternative uses for this capital. And so it's kind of like, we had this planning phase, and then you're recommending that there be another planning phase. And it strikes me as a very traditional, more waterfall type project where you're doing very expensive upfront planning without actually starting to do any actual development. And I wanted to kind of ask you, why isn't there a more agile approach?
What was the logic to that?
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I can answer that. So it is an agile approach, but even in agile, that doesn't mean you don't think about the scope of the project before starting. So the discovery phase isn't to go do what a waterfall discovery phase would be, which is go consider all of the functionality to be included, document it, walk it down, do the design work, understand exactly what it looks like for purposes of understanding exactly the duration, exactly the functionality to be delivered. The discovery phase, what I've seen work personally in a discovery phase is ultimately understanding at a high level, in agile terms, at a large epic level of functionality that is to be delivered, and start to think about things like viability of how you would build it, what interactions you might need. I also think that discovery phase is going to be needed for things like how will you interact with the state of California, right? I think if you don't do that, if you don't do what we often call sprint zero, right, before we actually start iterating through actual development sprints, if you don't think about those sorts of factors, then I feel like you're walking into it uninformed. And what I mean is, if you're talking about epic levels, it will have these functionalities at a high level. The agile process would then kick in and you would become much more granular at the actual functional level and say, is this a function that is more important than this function to deliver? And so you'd start iterating through it in an agile way. So there still is environment setup, there still needs to be an understanding of how the program will run. You still need to have an expectation as to what exactly you're going to build, not in minute detail like you would in waterfall, but at least at a high level, epic level understanding of what it is ultimately you're going to do. And then those epic level, the agile approach would be applied to it in that you're not going to come out of the process with exactly what you think you're going to come out of, but you have to have a sense of how you're going to approach the problem. What are going to be the major levels of functionality, and how are those things going to fit together? And then when you actually enter the sprints, then those would be saying, okay, we have these epic level stories, let us break these down into much more functional user stories, and let's iterate over those user stories, knowing that it's going to change along the way, and that we're going to accommodate that change as opposed to oppose that change, which is what we do if we started with a waterfall type phase.
Yeah, so I mean, I agree that there are decisions that need to be made, prior to starting, but why does that cost $1 million? Like, why couldn't that be? A lot of these are more organizational decisions.
Mm-hmm.
Like, why not? It seems like that could be done by a single staff person who's talking with stakeholders.
Yeah, I think it's much bigger than that, which is why multi-person process to think about not just the technical design and the components and the functionality to be done, but program-related stuff too, like security and when you will be securing it and what that process might look like. Again, at a high level, not at a very minute, fully defined level and fully baked level. I just think there's lots of parts of the process that all have to be thought through before you can actually get to the point where you're actually building. And so that phase essentially to do that. And in comparison, I think that we have in the document that LA County, I think, is $15 million into that process before actually, they basically have a design at this point, $15 million in. So I think that the $1 million figure is pretty reasonable based on other evidence that we have, where they've spent an awful lot of time thinking about not just technical solutions viability, but also the program itself and how that program will function.
Yeah, I mean, LA, that was a sole source contract, so they didn't really have a bidding process. But so another kind of approach would be, the director mentioned that if we were to choose, there's maybe 6 to 8 components of a system, depending on how you count it. But why must all 6 to 8 components be defined before you start building one of them?
They wouldn't. Yeah, they wouldn't. You wouldn't fully define all of those functions, but you would certainly need to, in Agile terms, you have to fill your backlog. What's in your backlog before you start iterating, right? You have to have stories to be able to start iterating through. So what is it? That phase is essentially, from a delivery standpoint, is loading the backlog with the actual stories that you would then start to break down into detail and start looking.
Well, so I guess my question was, if the city were to decide to build, like the director said, 2 or 3 components for starters, then this discovery phase that you're talking about, you wouldn't necessarily need to invest in the other components that you're not going first.
Correct. Correct. And that's correct. Yeah, you wouldn't have things in your backlog when you started doing development for the 8th system that you're going to build. You would have you would have stories in your backlog that are describing the first things that you're going to tackle, and if that's system number 1, 2, and 3, great. But I think it's also all of the other things that relate to the program, not just the backlog of actually the software development.
Okay, so if in the first phase it was to develop fewer than all the components, then the cost of the discovery would be less.
No, I think discovery is still that to be able to get started. I think there's that much work to consider to be able to get to a point where you're ready with the appropriate team, with the appropriate resources, with the appropriate skill sets available and ready to start working on the program with an understanding at a high level of where you're going to head.
So even if it was just a results reporter, it would still cost $1 million?
No, but I don't think, in my opinion, you don't want to look at only one slice of it in a vacuum without having considered all of the other components, at least at a high level. So you would be considering the end goal of where you want to be and what implications that has, but you'd be doing more detailed work on the first thing that you're going to tackle.
Okay. So my next question is, in your recommendations, you have, you're recommending that the Department of Technology own the project. And my question is, if that were to happen, would the commission still have a role in overseeing the project?
I don't know if we're able to answer that question. I don't have a point of view on how that structure would work. I mean, our finding wasn't so much as definitively as it must be owned by the Department of Technology. It was just that appeared to be the most logical place for it, for the scale and complexity of a project like this and the skill set that the Department of Technology has and their function. So, but we made no evaluation or assessment on how this commission would interact with it.
Okay. So I want to kind of get into the costs a little bit. On page 14, at the bottom, you have sort of like the total of the professional services associated with development, and your range is between 11.5 million and 28 million. And 2 years ago at the commission, we had a meeting where we invited 6 different vendors to kind of present what they thought they could do the project for, and those estimates ranged from, I think, 3 million to 14 million at the highest, and there was like an 8 million estimate. there too. But but I'm kind of wondering, why are your costs higher than all those amounts? And did you have a chance to speak with the people that presented at that meeting?
We spoke with OSET as one of the folks that was at that meeting, and had them threw out a number where we were at that point in time and said, does this strike you as something that's in range or out of range? And they thought it was that we were on the right track based on their track record of having built something like this over a number of years. They don't have a complete system, but they have some of the parts and some of the framework to be able to move forward with it. So they thought it was in range, and the methodology that we used to arrive here was essentially breaking it down into what skill sets are required to deliver, what timelines do we think we need to deliver, what order of execution would it be, how much allocation would each of those resources be required. For instance, there's certain skill sets like perhaps security that during a build phase you wouldn't need 100% of the time, so that there was a scale there applied about how much percentage would be, and then also thinking about what the certification cost would be and what the team associated with the certification cost would be. And we did that essentially for every system that was to be considered here in its pieces, and then essentially rolled them up. And as we rolled them up with those figures, we tried to supply a little bit of information about like kind of rough team sizes and rough rates, because again, depending on who you contract, those could be exactly right. They could be a little low, they could be a little high, depending on how that ultimately ends up. So that was the methodology that we arrived with, and we did kind of triangulate a little bit with some information that we had from LA County and with some conversations with OSET. There isn't really a lot of other folks who've built something like this, so that's kind of how we tried to triangulate and come up with our numbers. We did that in a vacuum first, and then we kind of put those things out there and said, does this seem like it? And if not, like why, and so forth, and try to triangulate it. So that's how we essentially arrived at these numbers. The delta between the two is large because we're working without a set of requirements. The actual what is to be included in a voting system, what is in and out of scope, there's small decisions that could be made in that could vastly change the scope of the system one way or another. And so because we essentially have created a model for what a voting system might look like without a set of requirements, that gap and that delta between the two costs is fairly wide. And as that discovery phase happens, and some of those conversations at a high level about what is in and what is out, and what methodology will be used and what's acceptable or not acceptable, that number, of course, would get, that window would get a lot smaller. But that's essentially where we are today.
Yeah, no, OSET, they were the ones that had the highest, the 14 million estimate, and I think the next one after that was the 8 million. So
I do think, and I would just say one more thing, I do think that some of the other vendors that may have presented may have not been thinking about the full set of costs that might be incurred. I think that there's a little bit of a tendency to think about the software and the build of the software without some of the other things that happen around it. And so I think as I was thinking about this, when I did initial estimates, I think I fell a little bit into that trap. And then as I thought more about some of the implications of some of these things happening, the number kind of came up as I started to think about some things that were happening there.
Okay, on page 17, you have the cost for the central ballot counting, which is the vote by mail, and you have 0.95 million to 2.4 million. And then lower, two more rows, you have the vote reporting, which is on the same order, it's 0.86 million to 2 million. And you know, as a software engineer, the vote reporting seems much easier, because it's just, you basically need to generate you know, maybe some HTML pages for the public and maybe some PDFs for the statement of vote. But the central ballot scanning, that's, you're dealing with hardware, high volume scanning, you have to interpret voters' marks. So I'm wondering why are those the same cost?
If
roughly?
I understand your question correctly, this is the services cost, not including the hardware costs. So those scanners, the cost of those scanners would be a lot more for like the central scanning.
Well, I mean the software that would take a scanned image and then generate the votes
well,
on that.
And you could be right, but we're working without a set of requirements and without a clear understanding of exactly which functionality should be in which module. And so there's a bit of, this is how I think it will work, because we don't have a particular set of requirements. And so I essentially kind of created that idea of what I thought it was going to be, and in the appendix there, at least at a high level, I tried to create some bullet points around functionalities that would be included in each of those systems. So I guess what I would say is this was based on what I thought that system will be, and therefore there's also a fairly big delta, understanding that the specific requirements of what may be in one system or another. So I think there's a possibility that one of these systems may contain functionality that you think is more appropriate in another one of the systems. For instance, things like, I don't know, where perhaps like if there's historical data to be stored, if there's things like requirements around how long you keep data or don't keep data, some of those sorts of things, those things could be in one of the modules, whereas you're envisioning it in different modules. So I guess without going into some specifics about what is each one does and how it does it, it's hard for me to say whether it should be more as you think it should, or it should maybe perhaps be less.
Okay, and I've just got two more questions. This is more on the services and the support. So this is on page 22. You have the support line here is 0.985 million to 1.97 million per election. And so for our current voting system, for the Dominion system, the election services are $497,000 per election. And here, the support costs are at the low end, they're double that. And I guess my question is why would the services for open source be double for a proprietary system? Because it seems like with the proprietary system, they have a monopoly on servicing that system. So
Simple answer.
The expectation we have is that we would have double as many machines as we had before.
well, that's
So the paragraph above
Well-
on page 22.
the maintenance is the maintenance that's covered by the bottom row here, maintenance and licensing. So you doubled both of those costs, the maintenance and the.
Yeah, the current support that you have is roughly half of that number today. And we are expecting that there will be double the number of devices that are going to be in place.
Okay, well, it would be double the number of accessible devices, right? But the number of
Correct.
precinct scanners would be the same, right?
Correct, yes.
So it would be 50% more for the number of machines.
I'd have to go back and look again at a deeper level.
Okay, and also, did you ask, because I know Alameda County does their servicing in-house, and were you able to find out from them how much they charge, how much their services cost?
We did not find out that information.
Okay. All right, that's all I've got for questions.
Okay.
Yes.
Yes, please.
So,
Commissioner Mogi.
where can, I'm just trying to look, yeah, I do see that, I know that we didn't provide much scope or considerations, but the cost of it just ranging so high, it is really hard to really grasp each scenario. Where can I find the recommendations, just because I also haven't had a chance to really deep dive into this, of like, pinpoints where we could consider where it would lower costs, where are the big jumps in the cost, just because I'm not able to grasp this right away from what I'm looking at. Is there some areas that we should consider, or like constraints that we should be considering, or like scope of work that we should be considering that would help us kind of determine this gap to be like a little bit, shortened?
How do you
Yeah,
reduce
like, yeah.
the
You're
window?
talking about the range of...
The ranges, yeah.
Plus, we put in sort of plus 100%, basically to give the, because of the level of uncertainty, the number of risks. The fact this hasn't really been done before on this scale by this group. You know, there's a number of factors. So we, like with any project through its life cycle, as Andrew mentioned, as you go further through it, the window should shrink. That was part of the goal of the discovery phase too. You know, it's any project will go through that as it goes through its life cycle. I think that was one half of your question. The other half of your question was like specifically where, like what are some of the levers?
Yeah.
I kind of heard from you. Is there a opinion on that? I don't. It's not really how we
Can
build
you
the.
can you restate your question?
Well, I guess like if I look at something that's like 11.5 million to 27.8 million, I just can't even grasp like where does the big jump happen. I understand that there are, like, we haven't given enough kind of criteria to consider, but I'm just trying to see, like, that is just a huge jump, or a range in general, and so I can't even think of like what an average cost would even look like because it's such
Sure.
a wide
Yeah, I mean,
range.
the first thing is do the discovery phase, which is the point at which you really determine what it is you're going to be doing. Right.
And how you're going to do it.
Right, and how you're going to do it. With which delivery model, with which people, with which vendors, in what order, with which skill sets. Will you be bringing it in-house? Is it something that you're going to hire for? Is it something you're using an outside vendor for? Will you partner with LA County, who's running ahead of you right now? Would you partner perhaps with somebody like OSIT, who is partway down that path too? All those things can narrow kind of the range at which costs will be. If you decided that you were going to build it with an outside vendor, right? You're going to hire another company. They were going to build it. They were going to do it in an open source manner. You could look at that number and you could say, what would reduce that window if we made that decision, right? Because those are some variables you have to decide on. If you did that, the first and most important thing you'd have to do is some of that requirements gathering. What is the definition of a voting system that meets the needs of what San Francisco needs to do? And I want to emphasize again, I know I've said it a few times, but we created a model based on some conversations that we had with lots of different parties actually about what a voting system might be, what an understanding of a, in quotes, standard voting system might look like. That standard voting system may or may not be a match for what you have, but we had to start somewhere because there's no requirements, and we didn't walk in with a set of requirements. And so that gap is large because there is no agreed upon set of requirements as to what will be built and how it will be built. So that number can get a lot smaller when that has been defined.
And I would also build on that there's a section 5.2.2 where we go through the what Andrew described, like the different options and what the difference in cost might be. So we have to come up with some sort of baseline, and the options are generally all lower level of investment than that figure. So some might be more risky, some might be less risky, some might be less risky. But each one of those shows, yeah, through a different model, how the range is less. The window is still the window, but it's moving off a smaller number.
And then the last is the time frame. I see in page 37 that I assume this is kind of like what a 3-year time frame would look like. And then, but all of your ranges have ranged from 3 to 6. I guess where would the biggest where do you consider to be the biggest roadblock that would jump to 6?
As in why it's 100 plus 100%, like what could be that?
Yeah, like what could, yeah, because I see what a 3-year timeline could look like if we are on point going, let's say today we agree on discovery and then we move forward and we move forward. I could see what a 3-year timeline looks like, but at what point, I mean, maybe it is just as simple as we don't approve a discovery phase and we do a different model, but I'm just curious to see where you see the
I do think one of the big ones would be around procurement. How you would break up the system, whether you'd be able to use a single vendor for all parts or whether you have different vendors for each part. Interoperability with an existing system. If you have an existing system from a closed source vendor and you're building open source components to it, how you build those in a way that they can interact. We've talked about like a proposed approach to that, and actually Chris had great feedback for us around that place in particular. But how you interact with that closed source system that hasn't been evaluated, right? What are those points that could connect to it? Because an open source vendor doesn't necessarily have an incentive to let you interact with their closed source system. And so what we're saying is we believe there's a way you can do it, but how you do that could vary greatly. The procurement window, as I said too, I think is another really big one. How can you do that procurement, and what does the lead time in actuality look like? We've made some assumptions about what that looks like, but if you're using many different vendors and the skill sets are different between each one of those vendors, there could be some challenges in terms of lining these all up end to end, which is what we're displaying here.
Thank you.
Commissioners, other questions? I have one last question, and that is, at this point, people are digesting this report. It's going to go to Coit. The director is digesting the report, and very much appreciate you being here to answer our questions. But in terms of additional support for answering other questions on this, will you be available to Coit in particular? I think it sounds like they're key decision makers on supporting going forward.
Well, I don't have a question, but I just want to thank you. I mean, this clearly took a lot of work, and clearly put some careful thought into it. So definitely appreciate you and appreciate your work.
Thank you.
Yeah, very good. Okay, I think that's it for open source voting, unless.
Commissioner Johnson, we have to do public comment. But
Yes,
then,
I was going to do.
as well as the motion I wanted to make too.
Right. So do you want to make that motion now?
Sure. So
Then we'll hear public comment on the entirety.
yeah, so I kind of took notes here. So I'd like to make a motion that we as a commission support the recommendations of the Technical Advisory Committee in this document as part of today's packet. Communicate those to the mayor's office in Kuwait, and add that the commission support requesting at least $4 million from the city for the first year in support of that.
Do I have a second?
I just have a question. How did
Please.
this 4 million, can you, maybe, because I just haven't, I'm just looking at the report itself. Can you just explain to me the 4 million?
Well, the 4 million is sort of, it's a number that we chose last year.
Okay.
And I mean, part of it is, as we hear today, like, no one really knows what this is going to cost. And it's sort of like, we're not really going to know until we learn a little bit more and we actually start doing something. And
But it also referenced the Travis County, as that's what their initial funding increment was going to be, and it was, so between that and as Commissioner Jurdonic said, I propose that because it's also substantial enough, I think, to make progress as well as actually show that the city wants to move forward to entice vendors and other interest.
Is this motion, is it an oral motion, or have you written this up?
Yeah, I was going to say, do you have this in writing, or
well,
you need to capture it? again?
The Technical Advisory Committee's recommendation is in writing. Can we see what that looks like?
Is that in the TAC
You
document?
mean the 3-page document dated March 19?
It's 2 sides.
Yeah, this one?
Yeah, 3 pages, 2 sides.
This one? So the whole,
Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah.
But this doesn't have a dollar figure
Yeah.
recommendation.
Yeah, so again, the motion would be that we support this recommendation, and then secondly, communicate it to the mayor's office in Kuwait, and thirdly, we support requesting at least $4 million from the city for the first year of the project.
Do you think the commission has enough information and has been able to digest this enough to make that recommendation?
Well, for all 3 or just the first?
Yeah, the
first one?
whole thing.
Well,
The whole motion.
well, it's something we can talk about. I think Mr. Wasserman spoke about the content of the document. I mean, it's another issue is that we don't really have time. I mean, the budget process, the Director Ernst, how soon do you think the application needs to be submitted to Kuwait?
Rather quickly, because by the end of May is when the mayor's office closes the budget and moves over to the board for the board's review.
Yeah.
And so, I mean, we've got to go through the process of the application. It's going to be to April probably before I get it done. Then it has to go onto the court agenda. I don't know how often they meet. So sooner rather than later, for sure.
And what do you think about the dollar figure?
I don't know the number either. I don't know the number. It's better to ask. I think it's probably better to put a number in there and have Coit disagree with it than to not put a number in there. And also, if this probably will cost more than $4 million. So I think if Coit were to accept the $4 million figure for initial development of these components, then at least you've got some money to start with. If you put a lower number, then potentially you're going to limit your options.
Another issue is that the California Clean Money campaign is they're trying to work on obtaining state matching funds, and the language they're having is a 2-to-1 match, and of a total of $8 million. And if we were to allocate $4 million, that would match what California Clean Money is working on.
And so, and here just to be clear where this is coming from, this is the recommendation of TAC 2. You're
Yes.
speaking for TAC.
Yes.
So I did a quick arithmetic. So if we figure out that we're going to pay about $125,000 unloaded per person, you double that to cover all the fringe benefits and stuff. The average cost loaded for a person is $250,000. So now we're talking about 16 person years worth of work. So that's kind of my, quick calculation. And with 6 projects and discovery and all of that, you're going to get, and that's no additional hardware costs. So it looks like a big number, but it goes pretty quickly.
I guess my question isn't really about how big the number. One, my question was really like, oh, how'd you get that $4 million? So I'm glad that you talked about it last year. But if we are looking at it with like adjusting it to the timeline, does it actually equal to 4, or is it a little bit more from what we're being presented today? But just looking at just like the broader total cost of what it might look like, and then if we are trying to meet a timeline, does that match in your head? Because I'm just trying to make sure that we're recommending a proper amount, or is this just, even if we might not, are we actually asking for it because we might not get it, so it's better to ask for something than nothing? Like, I'm just kind of curious about the strategy behind the dollar.
There are a number of things. There's like 3 or 4 factors. Number one is, in speaking with the mayor's office, you got a sense from them of what they're willing to allocate. That's number one. Number 2 is this state matching funds that the California Clean Money campaign is working on. They're working on $8 million at a 2-to-1 match, which would mean that if we were to, $4 million would be exactly the amount where we could receive all those state matching funds. So that's the second thing. A third thing is that $12 million matches the low end of their development costs in the Slalom report. And also, to me, I mean, from a personal level, that seems like the minimum you need to actually start making some real progress in the first year. I think if we were only to, just for example, if it was like $1 million, that doesn't seem like you would really make that much progress in 1 year.
Yeah, I wasn't actually questioning the dollar, as I said. I was just making sure that the rationale is making sense with what we're requesting, because I apologize that I don't have much of the context about where the dollars are adding up to, because I'm looking at the solemn report, and if you are going to divvy it up by the years that we're going to use it, starting at, and this is approval for budget for fiscal year 18-19, right? Like, I just want to make sure that we're asking for enough to get it, to make it a sufficient amount to move the project forward.
Yeah, so that's yeah. If it could be higher, the way I phrased the motion was at least $4 million, but just the sense I'm getting from the mayor's office is that it probably wouldn't. It would be a fight even to get 4.
Got it. Thank you.
Commissioner Judonic, I just wanted to clarify, I did want to put something to be precise in writing here. So I tried something, let's check and see if we got it right. So the San Francisco Election Commission supports the recommendations of OSB TAC. Is that right? Supporting that for us. And will provide written communication to the Mayor's Office and COIT supporting proceeding with the open source voting system project and with a budget amount, and recommends a budget amount of at least $4 million in the next fiscal year.
Yes.
Would that be?
You want funding this fiscal year as well, correct?
Something
Well,
else.
what do we mean by next? The one that they're deliberating over right now?
Right, that's next fiscal year, but do you also want to try to obtain funding for the current
And
fiscal year?
And the fiscal year actually starts in October?
Or July 1st?
July.
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't know we can do that.
That's what I meant by next. The one that starts in July
Okay.
1st.
All
Why
right.
don't we just say that?
Okay.
Why don't we just
Okay.
say
Fiscal year 18, 19.
2018, 19.
Okay.
And also another reason for the 4 is COIT they already saw that we requested 4 last year.
Got
So
it.
this will be the second year in a row.
Thank you.
Okay. Do I have a second for the motion?
Second.
Okay, I have a second. We will take public comment at this time. Let's see, where in the room is the best place to go? Do you have, we have the phone here. How about if we do it here on this area of the table?
Between Mr. John and Mr. Watson.
All right. Yes, please.
All right.
Please state your name, and we will have a few minutes on...
Yeah, I'm Rowan Cattell. I'm also, like Mr. Wasserman, I'm a member of the TAC, but I was not the designated person today. So I have a few items I'll try to go through quickly. First, I did some quick math on the numbers that Slot put in the report. If you take out all the things that we did not recommend as part of the initial system, so that's the initial iteration, that's the accessible voting system, which is half their cost, and precinct scanners and the remote accessible voter mail system, the range you end up with is $5 to $11.5 million. So that is that is very apropos, Mr. Janik's resolution for $4 million, especially if there's matching funds from the state. This first iteration, according to page 37 of the report, it's a bit difficult to read because it's black and white, so I can't, the white on white for some of the ranges I can't see. But it seems that would take about, it would take 1.5 years until you have developed that part of the system by their timeline. And then there's a certification range after that that's white on white, so I can't see what it is. But that's, oh, you have the color copy, excellent. So with the certification range, it would be 1 year and 3/4. Thank you very much. Then, as I already pointed out, the accessible system is half the development cost, and I'm by no means saying that we shouldn't have one, but that is definitely the most complicated and most expensive part, and it should not be developed first. Then on page 15, Solemn outlines 4 or 6 different options for who should develop what. Many of those options involve the city or the department doing the development in-house. I would recommend against doing that. I would recommend engaging vendors. In particular, option 4 points out that if you engage a vendor that has existing assets that can be used, and the cost would come down on that too. And if such a vendor exists and is willing, then they will bid in RFPs with lower bids. And capitalism at work and all that. And I think that is all I had. And just generally, I would also say I support this. I support this motion. I support this resolution, and I hope that we can get funding for this project. Thank you.
Thank you. Member of the public? State your name. Thank you.
My name is Jim Soper. I'm with the Voting Rights Task Force. I would like to thank these gentlemen for what is obviously a lot of hard work. Thank you. I was in Sacramento 2 weeks ago for this hearing on cybersecurity and election systems. And there was one thing that I took away from that, which Senator Allen had asked the Los Angeles Registrar, what do you think about open source? And the answer came back, oh, we are using an open source platform. and Roger has a quizzical look, and I was fortunately able to talk to Mr. Logan afterwards and say, well, you mean we're going to be able to look at the code? And he said, no. An open source platform means Linux or Java programming language, not the product itself. So do not be confused. I mean, was on a phone call Monday and somebody said, oh, LA is doing open source. They're not. He said that the tabulator and the voting station are likely to become disclosed at some future date without making any commitment to that. Disclosed is different from open source in that the county retains ownership of the software and who can do what with it. The other thing is, and this probably was not in the what they were asking, but there were a couple questions that were not being asked, and one of which, for those of us going off to Sacramento trying to raise money for this project, how much money is this going to save the state of California if this were to go very well? Now that's wild speculation, but you need to think about that, and we who go to Sacramento need to go up there with, well, I'm saying hundreds of millions, and I don't think I'm wrong, but I have nobody backing me up on that. So that's a question that at some point would be good to answer. And the other is, what is the risk if we don't do this to the country? This is the last project left in this country. We've had very close elections in Virginia. We had a very close election in Pennsylvania. And we need to take in consideration that the long-term impact that this could have across the nation. And I would say that that value would be priceless. Thank you.
Thank you. Next. Just trying to fill time.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate that.
Hi, I'm Trent Lang, the president of the California Clean Money Campaign. We are a statewide organization, a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that works on money in politics and fair elections. We have found a lot of support amongst our 110,000 members in California for this issue. And as Chris said, we are working closely now with Assemblymember David Chu and Senator Scott Wiener on a proposal to get up to $8 million in matching funds from the state budget. As Chris said, on a 2-to-1 basis for any components that are done in time to actually be piloted, tested in San Francisco in the 2020 election. So it has that incentive that for the city to allocate the funds quickly enough to get that done, so the state has that benefit. It would continue on for any components, so partial components would qualify for that. So if you only get the vote by mail portion, then that would qualify for the 2-to-1 match. If you continue the project after that until the 2022 election, then that would qualify for a 1-to-1 match. So there's built-in incentive there. The other part of the key incentive for the state is the value is it being an open source system, but also being a strong copyleft open source system. Specifically, we're currently proposing General Public License 3.0, like your commission has been talking about, which is perfect. That way, the state and all the counties will benefit from this also. That's the benefit to the state from allocating these funds. So we think there's a good chance of it. We strongly approve of the approach of the Technical Advisory Committee to get these portions started. As Chris said, the $4 million would work very nicely if the city does allocate the $4 million now. The state would match $8 million. And ideally, you can go full speed ahead and get as much as possible of the system done in time for 2020 to get that 2-to-1 match and match at least the lower ends of the estimates for the cost of the system. So,
30 seconds.
Okay, thank you. So I have been talking with Chris about this. I've offered to speak with the director if he has, or any of you, if you have any feedback on the actual proposal that we're working with Assemblymember Chu and Senator Weeder. We're thrilled at all the progress you have been making and excited and look forward to supporting that however we can, especially in terms of helping get budget both in the city and the state.
And if I may, give us a nutshell of what that proposal is that you're working on with Chu and Weiner.
The nutshell would be for the next state budget, an allocation of up to $8 million in matching funds. The state budget is already, they're having hearings, budget committee hearings now. That state budget has to be approved by June 15th. So actually the city and the county will know before they do their budget whether or not these $8 million in matching funds will be available before the county makes its final decision. Key parts that we're talking with Assemblymember Chu and Senator Weiner about are some of these requirements, because it's meant to be both helpful financing but also encouragement to the county to fully fund it and to move quickly enough. So the requirements being that it be general public license 3.0, the 2-to-1 match on any parts piloted and then certified by the Secretary of State after the 2020 election, the 1-to-1 on 2022. If the state will provide under our current proposal, and this is not set in stone, and so we are actively seeking feedback and have gotten some so far, but the current proposal would be that the state would provide the money up front on the 2-to-1 basis for any monies that the county allocates now or up until 2020, so you can actually use the funds to actually pay for the vendors or however you're going to end up developing it. It would have a thing at the end that by 2024, if all the matching funds weren't used up by having a system that it was tested and then certified by the Secretary of State, or at least components that are tested and certified by the Secretary of State, then at that point the county would have to give back whatever funds they didn't earn through these matches. That's the current proposal that we have.
Is the governor's office behind it?
We've not yet had a chance to speak with the governor's office behind it yet. We've talked with several legislators, for instance, Senator Allen, Speaker Pro Tem Kevin Mullen supports the basic idea, and we're having these initial discussions with Assemblymember Chu and Senator Weiner. What they asked us to do first was to get a letter in support from the mayor's office and from Budget Chair Malia Cohen, saying that they support this state budget request, and basically that they think that San Francisco would be well in good place to follow up on it. We know they can't necessarily commit, but they want San Francisco to actually ask for it, to say at least the key budgetary leaders to show that they want this and would use it.
And that was the ask by Senator Tony Atkins. Is that what you're saying?
No, that was asked by Senator Weiner and Assemblymember Chu, said for them to really push forward this proposal that they're very much behind. They know that will only be successful if the mayor and the budget chair say that they support it and would like to see it go forward. So we've had a meeting with the mayor's office. We just had a meeting with Malia Cohen's office to describe it. So I'm reasonably optimistic that they will send the support letters that would help us push this process forward, but we'll have to see. If they do, I think that we've got a very good chance at this. This is really a key moment in time. Everybody gets the issue right now, especially of the need for securing our elections. I think there's a lot of attention to that in Sacramento. The coalition that we, as California Clean Money Campaign, can bring to the table has had great success influencing the legislature. So if San Francisco requests it, I think there's a good chance that we'll be able to achieve it. And I think that's why the request by the Elections Commission for $4 million to start this funding process, besides the reasons that he said, will that will be the perfect amount to really get that full matching funds that Assemblymember True and Senator Wiener think that there's a good chance of our being able to procure if everybody's behind it.
Yeah, Mr. Lang, so he's been doing a lot of excellent work building support in the community. Can you say a word about the communications your members have been doing for the city?
Yeah, so just last night we sent out our first communication to our to over 6,000 of our supporters in the city of San Francisco, asking them to send emails, sign a petition sending emails to key leaders, to the mayor's office, to the budget chair's office, to the supervisor president's office, also to the commission general email address, to the Department of Elections general email address, and to a couple leaders in Coit. And as well as their individual supervisors, and my last check, a little over 300 people just since yesterday have already signed, and there's a small army of people going out to the March for Our Lives event in San Francisco on Saturday with clipboards and paper petitions asking people to sign, urging the mayor and the budget chair and the supervisor president and the other supervisors to allocate fully fund the open source project. So that we're expecting I think a substantial kind of grassroots movement here in San Francisco. We're going to be working on that already. Already working with different grassroots leaders that have been engaged in this process for I know for a long time. Already had first meetings, so we expect a robust campaign, including hopefully an open source campaign kickoff in early May about this, as we push to build support both for those state budget matching funds and for the city and county to fully allocate and fund the system, at least ideally with this $4 million request that you guys are considering making.
Thank you for exercising your voice.
Thank you.
It's really your work.
You're welcome. Thank you. And thank you for all of your work. It's great that we're able to come in, and San Francisco is on the cusp of doing something really important for the country.
Any other questions? Yes.
My name is Alex. Looks like mine. Recommendations also Director Arns' approach towards proceeding with this, the motion that is in front of you. Some other things to point out, of course, that with vote by mail being almost 2/3 of the people within San Francisco, if we go forward with just this one component, which would be much less costly than trying to add really state-of-the-art accessibility machines in every precinct, we get really amazing bang for the buck with that. And kudos to LA for all that they've done on increasing accessibility, but I believe that a very high percentage of the work that they've done has gone into maximizing their ability to do that, more on that than on the systems itself, I think, based upon a presentation that I heard. And while it would be wonderful for San Francisco to have that also, that's not really a cost of the open source system. It would be a cost of San Francisco moving to the next level on accessibility. For the Secretary of State, given that the money would be coming out of the Secretary of State's budget as allocated to him, Alex Padilla would probably have some incentive to work with the City and County of San Francisco on an incremental approach to this, because he would already be working with the city in terms of allocating money, and not that there be any conflict of interest, but there would certainly be a close working relationship, because there would be that 2-to-1 match that would be coming out of his budget based upon state allocation. Also, Alex Padilla had been supportive of having California being able to certify election systems when he was a state senator. In fact, his bill is the one that passed, which means we only need to go to California and not to the Federal Elections Commission. As Commissioner Jordanek indicated, there are some costs associated with the open space system in the report, which would not really be associated only with an open space system. And of course, one of the major one was that accessibility issue, but also from Director Arntz's report to the Local Agency Formation Commission, which has done the prior report of estimating about $500,000 a year for the vendor costs. It wouldn't really double if you add one accessibility machine in each of the voting precincts, because if you look at those items in the LAFCO report on page 23, many of those are items that they have people there. I think the only one that would really double would be the cost of transportation, if that is bringing one more machine per precinct out of the Pier 48 or wherever they might be stored. So I would question even that number, simply doubling it because you'd have one more accessibility machine in each place. So looking at the numbers as we go forward will be very important. Thank you for your time, for all you've done.
Thank you. Other members of the public?
Thank you, President Donaldson and Commissioners. My name is David Carey. First, I would like to recognize the California Clean Money Campaign for its recent support and its efforts to open up funding opportunities that have so far eluded San Francisco's open source voting system. The California Clean Money Campaign is dedicated to implementing governmental policy that makes our elections freer, fairer, and more functional. The open source voting system is one aspect of that. I've seen them in action on other issues. They are effective and can provide a much needed complement to the efforts of the Commission to obtain this funding. If anything, the challenge for the Commission will be, can you keep up with them? Are you ready to act to deliver on a timely basis what only you and the Department of Elections are able to deliver so that these funding opportunities do not pass you by? I have to say I've been very encouraged by what has happened here in this meeting so far tonight in terms of looking forward for ways to get some funding here in this current budget cycle. Second, I have been impressed with what the Technical Advisory Committee has been accomplishing, not only in terms of the quality of their recommendations, but also their process. They serve as a model of a successful, open, agile, iterative development process in a governmental setting. It is a process that is modern, tailored to its purpose, technology savvy, staffed with appropriate skills and experience, and might I say, cost effective. Other aspects of the, I'll just say kudos to the Commission for setting up and sponsoring TAC. I encourage the Commission to follow TAC's recommendations about how to proceed with any next round of funding. And finally, I'll note that I have spent a fair amount of time reading through the Slalom report, have a number of questions, and if you prefer, particularly if they're ready to respond to them later, I'd be happy to submit those to the Commission at a later time. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Gary. Other members of the public? Seeing none, we'll turn to the motion that's on the table. I would offer the or request a friendly amendment to include the budget chair of the Board of Supervisors, Maria Cohen, in that letter that we would be writing. That
sounds fine.
Mr. Dominic is accepting. Any other comments on the motion before we take a vote?
I have a question on just more on the application, the toy application. Is there a space to actually discuss like possible additional resources that you would gain by getting the $4 million? Like you said that there would be a potential opportunity, because there's a proposal on that where
I don't know.
just to make this be stronger.
Yeah, I don't know the application well enough.
Okay.
Yeah. I can get back to you on that, but I couldn't tell you.
Yeah, it would be just good to know. I know that, I've done kind of these projects too, and it's sometimes like raising certain dollars helps, receive other state fundings and other things, and I know that kind of encourages, other folks to be more supportive of certain projects over others. So it would just be a good thing to note if there is an opportunity to put that in the application. Yeah, thank you.
So thank you. Before we vote, actually, I'm just considering one other item that perhaps as a friendly amendment would be to requested the mayor's office and the chair of the budget committee of the board of supervisors to send a letter to the secretary of state. I guess that would be their signature in support of this, or was it no to the senator, to the state senators stated earlier?
To the budget chair, the state, budget chair King in the Assembly and Senate budget chair.
Assembly member Chu and Assembly member.
You could do that, or budget chair Phil King, who's the chair of the Assembly Budget Committee, and
maybe just say the
You
relevant.
could just say
members of the Senate.
the relevant, the relevant
the chairs of
Yeah.
budget committees for
Okay.
each house.
Yeah, there you go.
There we
That's
go.
better. Sorry, I'm blanking with it.
Good.
We won't forward that in the transcript.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
Speaking of not in San Francisco, so.
I would offer that as an additional friendly amendment.
Maybe it makes sense to reread the motion
Yes.
and then get a second.
The phone number?
One moment.
How do you read that when it's so tiny?
Is it? I've got glasses. It's good eye exercise. Supervisors. To the, okay. Sure. Do I need to put both bodies?
I think that explains it, I
Okay.
feel.
It's clear enough?
I think it's pretty clear.
To matching funds. Is that it?
To the chair of the budget committee of this,
Chair of
right, because it's not the
the-
chair,
yes.
yeah. We should make this longer.
Yeah, can we add an additional paragraph?
Yeah. Some of our personal comments too.
Okay, it's going to be long, but I think it will be precise. Okay, the San Francisco Election Commission supports the recommendations of OSB-TAC and will provide written communication to the mayor's office, COIT, and the, get her in here, and the, COIT, and the chair of the budget committee of the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. In support of the city proceeding with open source, with the open source voting system project, and recommends a budget in the amount of at least $4 million for the 2018-2019 fiscal year, and requests and encourages the mayor and the chair of the budget committee of the Board of Supervisors send a letter to the chair of the budget committee of the California State Legislature, of the bodies of the California State Legislature, to request to commit to matching funds for development of an open source voting system.
I would just, the last part, just, I would say in support of the state matching funds request.
Okay. In support. report of the state's
Matching funds budget item.
matching funds. Okay. You guys good, or you want me to read it again?
We're good.
All right. Call for the vote. Commissioner,
We're
do you
going to do
want a
another
second?
first
A
and second.
second.
oh, do we need to do, okay,
So is that your motion and your second?
Yeah,
okay.
there we go.
Okay, we'll call for the vote. Commissioner Judonic,
Yes.
Commissioner Jung,
Yes.
Commissioner Mogi,
Yes.
and myself, Roger Donaldson, yes. The motion passes. We'll follow up with a letter as called for by this motion, and thank you everybody, and thank you for the public comments, and also the director and Slalom for all of their information and work on this item, and we'll look forward to moving forward. Next item on the agenda, approval of minutes of the previous meeting. Do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Do I have a second?
Okay.
Four. Any discussion on this item from the commissioners? No. Any comments from the public on the approval for minutes? Seeing none, call for a vote. Commissioner Judonic?
Yes.
Commissioner Jung?
Yes.
Commissioner Mogi?
Yes.
Commissioner Donaldson, yes. Item 5. Commissioner reports. I would like to open this topic by just mentioning that Commissioner Rowe, who is not present, did let me know beforehand as an excuse. I do not have the same for Commissioner Sapon, but I hope she's okay and doing well and had something come up. Okay, so Commissioner reports. Commissioner Judonic.
I don't have anything to report on this item.
No? Commissioners, any reports on any of these items? Okay. I guess I would simply mention that I have reached out to the Department of HR on the last item, which we will do, we expect to do in closed session. So I've been working on that as well. If there's no other discussion, we'll move on to item 6. Public comment on Commissioners' reports. Seeing none, let's move on to the Director's report.
All right,
Director
thanks.
Rawns?
So, in addition to the written report that I provided, I want to add a few things. One, we learned today, or last week actually today is when the final date was set, Secretary of State, the motor voter bill for legislation will be effective April 16th. And so the Secretary of State is starting to issue the regulations and guidance to the counties, and also to give us a sense of how DMV, the Secretary of State's office, will transfer information during transactions that occur at DMV. Also, the LAC meeting, which was stated in my director's report for next Tuesday, we'll have to postpone that because there's a regional USPS meeting that the United States Postal Service is organizing, so we're going to attend that. And then, actually, prior to the regional meeting, we're going to have a meeting with the local postal representatives regarding specifically our mailings for the June and somewhat November election. The pilot program for the Dominion system, which is the proposal that was responsive to the RFP that issued on February 1st, we'll have that after the June election. I thought previously to have it prior to June and try to grab people or as they were voting at City Hall, but our Voting Accessibility Advisory Committee folks thought it was best not to confuse the voters potentially would they vote on the pilot program system, not realize they didn't really cast the ballot for the actual election. Also, after June, it gives us a chance to travel to various locations and provide demonstrations and provide people the opportunity to test the equipment, such as folks with disabilities, seniors, things like that. Then also, so we're also working with a vendor that's providing the remote accessible vote-by-mail system. So we're making a San Francisco-based content that we can use. And again, we're going to be doing a traveling demonstration for folks like at regional learning centers and things like that in town within the next few weeks. So we're developing a San Francisco-specific content for the demonstration ballot with the remote accessible vote-by-mail system. So that's my non-included information. So.
Okay, great. Questions for the director?
Yeah, 2 questions. So does that mean that the contract with Dominion would be signed after the pilot program, or you'd sign the contract through the pilot and then the payment would happen?
Potentially, the pilot program is part of the RFP, so so a contract is not necessary to conduct the pilot program. And then if you look at the RFP, there's an appendix actually that has insurance requirements that apply to any participants in the pilot program when they provide their equipment and services at City Hall during that demonstration. So it's a separate packet within the RFP. Potentially the contract could be done by then, but it's not necessary.
So you don't have to wait for the pilot to be done before signing the contract?
No.
Okay. And the last thing is, I don't see it mentioned here, but I was wondering if you could mention something about this court case related to signatures with vote-by-mail ballots.
Yeah, so I forget the plaintiff name. So someone brought suit in Sacramento, I believe, Superior Court. Is he here? That is, okay, there you go. Requiring or stating that counties must notify voters if the signature in the vote-by-mail, return vote-by-mail ballots does not match the image files that counties have on record. And the court agreed that counties should notify voters when counties determine that the signatures on file don't match what's on the return envelopes and the vote-by-mail ballots, which we already do. We've been doing that for, I think, 2-3 years. And then there's nothing in the law that compels us to provide that notification. And so we've tracked another law that requires voters an 8-day grace period after Election Day to provide a form with a signature if they did not sign the return vote-by-mail ballot. So we've kind of piggybacked on that legal structure when it comes to informing voters that their signatures must compare, and allowing them the opportunity to send us back a form that would also have space for them to provide an updated signature that we could use for comparison to what's on the envelope. I don't think that from what I read today, the counties won't be required to effectuate a similar program for June, but I would assume going forward that other counties will also be providing notice to voters who have miscompared signatures.
How were they able to do the court case here if we already do that? Was it in a different county or?
City wasn't a defendant.
No.
San Francisco wasn't a defendant.
Oh, okay.
I'm not sure why. I'm not sure how it was yeah, that's a good question. I'm not sure.
I haven't seen any filings. I don't know.
Yeah, but the city was not a defendant.
Right.
Okay. That's all I had. Thank you.
Okay. Other questions or comments on the director's report, commissioners? And public comment? Seeing none, move on to the next item. Yes, the election plan for the June 5th, 2018 election. So I will, and we have, so we have in the packet the election plan, and as well as a waiver resolution, and include the BOPEC minute drafts, as that will cover, even though they've not been approved. I've reviewed them, and having chaired that meeting, I would say these are accurate to my knowledge. that's sort of a summary of the discussion that happened there. The recommendation of the BOPEC committee was for the approval of the election plan as it stands. I guess I would just ask Director Arndt, have there been any changes to the election plan, or was it final as of the BOPEC meeting?
Yeah, it was final. I was supposed to add that script the poll workers were going to tell the voters. I forgot to do that. So I have to follow up. I can add that in there. Because the commission passed this policy that the voters are informed that there's accessible voting equipment available at the polling places.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, so I didn't go back and add that in. I got to do that yet. So.
Okay, so that still has to be done. We did approve it as it was written, however, at the BOPEC committee to be clear. Commissioners, any comments or questions on the election plan at this time?
So one thing, I don't think it's actually listed in the plan, but I just want to tell the commission it's something I spoke with you about, Director Arntz, related to the how the ranked choice voting contests are reported in the results. And it's something I had mentioned in commission meetings in the past, but basically, I mean, because we have a mayor's race this June, I thought it would be important. But if a voter is to go to the results page and they look at, say, the mayor's contest, all they'll see is the just the first round totals.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a little bit confusing because there's no indication that it's an RCV. So I was asking Director Arntz if like whether it'd be possible to have some kind of a link to the RCV results. And you looked into that, or?
Oh, we can do it. We just haven't done it yet.
Yeah. So. Okay, it's appreciate that.
Is it, because I mean, you could currently see it, is it that you want it to be more clear on that actual, like, candidate, like a link right above it kind of thing, or, because,
yeah, right now you have to click on like a tab at the top and
at the
open up a
top.
separate page.
Yeah, I guess we just constantly look at it, so it's intuitive, but like, yeah, I know that, I guess, yeah, you hear that as well. So
Yeah.
it's just like on the ones that actually have a ring choice, you want the link to be placed there as well.
Yeah, exactly.
Got it.
And then hopefully
That
it'll,
makes sense.
in our,
Sounds like good
in our
design.
next voting system, it'll automatically be clear. I mean, I don't know if you have an idea of that, but. Yeah, okay. Okay.
Okay. Any other questions, commissioners? Comments? I guess at this point we should entertain a motion before public comment. That's what I would like.
Did BOPEC have a recommendation on that?
Yeah, I mentioned that earlier. There was a recommendation
Sorry.
to approve as written. However, as Director Arntz pointed out, we did request that based on our policy from the county, or from the commission earlier, that there would be a statement regarding remote accessible voting as part of a script that would be provided to the poll workers at the time in the precincts. The director said he would get that added in.
So do you want a motion with that addition?
That's what I would suggest.
Okay, so moved.
Can I do it? Second.
Public comment on this item.
I read the election plan a few days ago, and I have a few minor comments and requests on it. I don't know if they're all germane, but they're all in reference to things that were in the quite lengthy election plan, so I should hope so. One is I support the request that Commissioner Janonik made to make the nature of RCV clear, because it is very possible for the person to be leading in first search votes totals to not actually be leading when you take RCV into account. And with that, the hourly updates as they're currently provided, the one at 8:45 that includes only vote by mail ballots and no precinct votes does include a full RCV elimination computation for how things work, but then the 9:45 and 10:45 p.m. updates don't. Those would only be first search totals according to the plan, and then the final one, when all the votes are counted, usually around 11:30 or so, would then again have an RCV computation. So especially in light of the competitive mayor's race that we've going on in this election, I would urge the department to make efforts to provide those RCV computations for every update, not just the first and last. because otherwise people will be quite confused and there will be important information missing from the updates in the middle as we see how this race actually develops. And as it's currently planned until 11:30, we won't really know anything. And then finally, my most ridiculous pet peeve is literally about $2. There is a high school poll worker program which pays high school students almost the same as adults, which I think is really great, but it pays them $2 less. So I know that it's way too late to fix that for this election, or maybe even November 1, but I would urge the commission to consider to, at least for symbolic reasons, address that issue. Thank you.
Mr. Cattell, are you going to be a poll worker at this election?
I hope so. I'll be at the training center the day after it opens, I think.
Thank you, Commissioners. My name is David Carey. I support the motion and the plan that is, as it's been put forward. I think it's great that they have a plan like this, and to see that the continued kind of improved format that we've seen in recent years is continuing. It's been a year and a half since I've had a chance to talk about it, so I'll just make a plug. I very much appreciate the improved ranked choice voting reporting that's going to be done and that is specifically called out in the plan. There are improvements. I certainly support both of the suggestions if those are at all feasible. I've been kind of looking at some of those improvements are things we might wait and see with the new interim system. But if there's any way to see those happen this time around, I'd certainly support those things. I'd also note that as in November 2016, there was success in reducing the voter wait times for people who came to vote here at City Hall on Election Day, and I'm kind of expecting to see those that continue. And just point out that I at least heard, while what I saw on Election Day was very good, I'd heard some kind of secondhand comments that maybe there were some other days when there had been some bigger backlogs, and so I know that it's hard to always project what the turnout is going to be on a particular early voting day, but encourage the department, and I'm guessing they already have, to look to keep lines short so people don't have to wait too long to vote here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. Seeing no further public comment, I guess, let's see. So we'll come back to the waiver. So we'll limit it to the election plan at the moment. So we have a motion on the table. Any further comment or discussion, commissioners?
I'm really fascinated by, I'm sorry,
Go ahead.
I'm just really fascinated by the $2 thing now. So, but I'm just like now reading it, like 900 high school students, that's how you recruit. And typically 2/3 of recruited students are bilingual fluent in one of the mandated language. I mean, I think that's...
I think it's a typo. I don't think it's less.
Huh?
I don't think it's less. I think it's a typo.
Oh, I didn't say less. Did I say less?
No, the $2. I think it's a typo. I'm not aware of us paying less than that.
Oh, so it might,
Yeah,
it is the same.
Yeah.
I think the amounts that I saw were 143 and 145, I think.
Yeah, I'm not aware of us paying less than high school.
Also,
Okay.
because of
Oh,
what?
$2 in total, the
Total.
stipend.
Yeah, the $2, yeah.
Well, if
One
that's,
for
if it's the right
It's not
amount.
per hour.
Okay. So it's just so they get paid the same.
Yeah.
Oh.
But to my knowledge, I'm not aware of it.
Okay.
Okay, well
Maybe
then
that's
we
just a
don't
mistake
know.
then, yeah. That's
So
even
like-
better news then. You
Is
don't have to find it.
No,
it
I
appear
don't
to be
see-
inaccurate in the,
I don't
or is this
see it.
outside of the?
Yeah, I
I
didn't
think
see
this is what I
that.
found on, I may have found this on the website, where it says, hey, be a poll worker, here's how much it pays. It may not have actually been reflected in the document itself.
Okay.
Yeah, it's not reflected in the document. I just like quickly looked through it, but so
Okay.
good to know.
Because of what you said, the average high school poll worker would actually still be paid more than the average adult poll worker because they're more likely to be bilingual. And there's a bonus.
There's an additional, yes,
Yeah.
an additional
So-
stipend for that. Yes.
Okay. So it is fair for both. Then I'm fine. I have no comments then.
Okay. Any other comments, commissioners?
Just want to thank the director for his good work.
Well, thank you.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Good work.
Very thorough. Also want to thank the director for pointing out that, yes, we had called out this item and that we were going to include something about mention consistent with the policy of the commission, asking and having part of the script about accessible voting equipment for the poll workers. So let's see, are we all clear on the motion at this point? Okay, good. So call for the vote. Commissioner Jordanek?
Yes.
Commissioner Jung?
Yes.
Commissioner Mogi?
Yes.
Commissioner Donaldson, yes. Okay, moving on to the waiver, the memorandum resolving to allow city employees to assist in the Department of the Elections for the June 5th consolidated election. Director Arndt, can you tell us if you are seeking anything or if this is informational? Should the commission take any action to support this, or?
Yes, to support it. The same charter amendment that created the Elections Commission in 2002 also included a requirement or a prohibition of any city employee assisting the Department of Elections in conducting elections unless the Board of Supervisors approved a waiver that was recommended to the board by the Elections Commission. So the department organizes elections almost 99% without the assistance of any city employees. However, there are some instances on election night, especially when we're getting the memory packs in from the polling places, where we get some IT folks usually from other departments to help us do the uploading. And then we do have some folks occasionally help us in other areas. Mostly it's on election night. So that's why I don't name people in the list of departments, because it's a fluid pool of people that could be helping us on election night. But primarily those are the departments that would be as kind to have their folks volunteer to assist us to upload the results so we can get them report on election night. So without the board approving the waiver that's recommended by the Elections Commission, then I've got to figure something else out for election night for the uploading of results in City Hall.
Thank you for that introduction.
And so the specific motion you want is to grant the waiver set out here?
Right.
Exhibit 9, okay. I move to grant a waiver from the prohibition imposed by Charter Section 13.104.5 to permit city employees to assist the Department of Elections with June 5, 2018 statewide direct primary election.
Thank you, Commissioner Jung. Do I have a second?
Second.
Thank you, Commissioner Mogi. Call for the vote. Commissioner Jordanek?
Yes.
Commissioner Jung?
Yes.
Commissioner Mogi?
Yes.
Commissioner Donaldson, yes. Thank you. Next item, agenda items for future meetings. Should we have taken public comment on that? Public should
No,
have.
you took it once.
All right.
We already
Okay,
did.
we already done that, great. Okay, agenda items for future meetings. Commissioners, any suggestions for agenda items for future meetings?
So,
Shorter meetings? Okay, members of the public, any public comment? Seeing none, we'll move on to agenda item 9, objectives and process for annual performance evaluation of the Director of Elections. This is a discussion and possible action regarding the preparation of objectives and process for performance evaluation of the Director of Elections going forward. With this, we'll take public comment now. If there is any, then we would vote on whether to meet in closed session, at which time we will discuss the process and the documents which already have been provided for public view in terms of just being a template at this point. And then we would have a discussion and then return to a public session where we would discuss at a high level what those results were. Is that correct, Deputy Attorney?
When you're in closed session, you would know what to disclose, and the idea of going into closed session is that you'd be having substantive. Well, so you can go into closed session if what you're going to discuss is sort of, specific, feedback and objectives that would fall within the personnel exception.
Got it.
If you want to just sort of discuss at a more general level the process without going into specifics about personnel, then you would have to have that discussion in open session.
Got it. So what I anticipated in this item.
Oh,
Thank
sorry,
you.
it looked like Chris had a comment.
yeah, I was gonna ask, like, do we actually even need a closed session for this? Because
Right.
if we're just going to
I
be
was
talking about
just
the
gonna say
process. Okay.
I was gonna suggest what I had anticipated on this item was going through the process as documented by the Department of HR, and then going into some details about what the process would be without specifics of the objectives at this time. However, if anybody, if any of the commissioners would like to go into more detail, as advised by Deputy City Attorney White, then we would go into closed session, right?
Okay.
So I think we would just start by, we can go into the documents as provided. This is essentially what we looked at before around the process. So I've included those again for our reference. So this is a memo from Mickey Callan, the Human Resource Director for the City and County of San Francisco, as of the 16th of October, for October 2016, which basically behind that memo has the documents associated with the appraisal plan. So, of course, we went through an appraisal process last year that included, that was based on the documents from the prior year. At this point, we are anticipating changing that process to something like this, and specifically to follow this plan, basically as laid out by the Human Resource Director. And furthermore, the suggestion would be that at this point we would ask the director to state objectives for the rest of this appraisal period, and the commission would also contribute items. And I further would suggest that based on what we did and discussed in the last performance appraisal process, this would include essentially those policies, and our objectives would be formed around those policies as part of the director's objectives coming from the commission. So so I guess I would just open it for comment at this point. If there are any questions, concerns about proceeding with something in terms of the process as documented in this memo from Director Callahan.
And you need a motion for this?
That's a good question. I guess it probably would be, we could certainly do that.
No, but is that what you want? Is that what you need?
I guess I had anticipated going into closed session and then figuring that out. But
So can I ask you just more of a clarifying question?
Sure.
Like, what is, I imagine, or correct me if I'm wrong, but the end goal of this is to basically, we want to have some kind of like a template, kind of like we had before for the evaluation process.
Right.
That we approve.
Yes.
And then it's going to be basically this form that's part of our agenda packet with some goals that we list out that we're going to evaluate him on. Is that
Correct. And that I would suggest that it would be two things. It would be, we would add what we thought the goals were based on policy, and and the policies I think we enumerated in the prior appraisal period, with the addition of this this statement about accessible voting equipment.
Mm-hmm.
Those would be the ones we would add here, and then we'd ask the director to contribute his objectives for the appraisal period, and then we would evaluate that and say, yes, this is the, so that would be at a future meeting. I would assume the next meeting of the commission, at which time we would review those objectives.
Would it be like a numbered scale, kind of like we had before, or would it just be more in the abstract, like a free form?
Well, what we would start with, if you look at the actual form, that it's basically just gives a big box in which to put which to put the goals. So that would be the objectives. In terms of actually evaluating it in the end, the appraisal process, I guess it does not actually call out for a scoring mechanism. So it is not that. It would be unless we wanted to add a scoring mechanism, it would be more a more subjective.
So then, for our purposes, we would need to agree on a list of goals with Director Arntz's feedback. Is that the idea?
Yeah, the idea would be that, well, I guess what I am suggesting is that we would include, it would be policy of the policies we've defined for the commission. That would be our objectives, and then Director Arntz would contribute what his performance objectives would be. And then that's what we would review in a future presumably closed session, because that would be very specific to the job. And then we would approve that as part of the, as the appraisal objectives.
Okay, so I'm confused. Are we approving anything for this commission meeting?
I guess, yes, I guess I would entertain a motion to follow the standard process of the City and County of San Francisco. And the second part of that motion I would suggest would be to include the commission's objectives, or commission's approved policies as part of that objective. And the third piece would be that we would request from the director his contribution of performance objectives for the appraisal period.
Okay, can I ask a question? So Deputy City Attorney White, like if Director Arndt's, so this first sentence says, in this section list the key goals you plan to accomplish or achieve within the year. That's sort of like before you start the year. And then if Director Arndt's were to provide a list like that, would that list be public, or would that be a part of the closed session?
I think if it's part of, that's.
It's like the goals that he wants to.
Yeah, I feel like it's more of a closed session issue.
Okay.
Because I think it's close enough to like a personnel discussion.
Okay.
Then it sounds like we would want a closed session.
Yeah, so it would be a future closed session. Yeah, unless we wanted to discuss further the objectives in this meeting.
As well. I mean, that's fine. You can discuss general. I think it's fine to just. I think if you start deviating much from this
Right.
form, it makes more sense to go into closed session because I just worry that it would touch on
Some
kind
specifics.
of personnel topics that the personnel topics that are sort of specific to the director's
Yes.
performance.
So I guess my suggestion would be that we leave it at the process discussion today, if we're good with that process, and then at a future meeting, which I would suggest would be the next meeting, we would go through the actual objectives and approve that as the objectives for the remainder of this fiscal year, and thereby align with the standard city process, and also give Director Arndt actually a target rather than waiting to see what we decided he would be appraised on at the end of that period.
So can I have a clarifying question? So is the commission's policy the one that's listed here? Or are these just recommendations of our policies?
Yes.
There's two.
This has been, this
are
was
the
input
questions.
from the last discussion.
So we haven't established a policy.
There is a process, and I guess I was not around when that was approved. I don't know if it was policy or process, but there was a process that we had followed, which was unique to the election commissioner and the director of elections. So these documents, I believe, is this the one that said, these were suggestions for how to handle this the last cycle. So that was one from Commissioner Giordano. And then the other one was separately a conversation about running an employee survey process that the city had been piloting at that time. And so we had talked about surveying or questioning the employees, and that would be something that I guess is not enumerated. I don't find it in this memo from Director Callahan, but I would, that I guess would be another piece that we could discuss at a future meeting, but the suggestion at that time was if the city is piloting and undergoing some sort of employee survey plan, that would be something we might want to, that we would want to also use in this process.
But in the current process that you're proposing, you would not recommend that.
Well, I guess what I was recommending for today was just that we get this part, this piece done, though we could include the survey piece in addition. And what I'm pointing to for the record is the memo from Mickey Callahan, which does not specify the survey.
So just to summarize, you're saying today we'll adopt that we're going to use this process, and then in the future meeting we'll fill in the blanks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Future meeting we would fill in the blanks, and we can discuss at that time. I would suggest the survey. I actually reached out to the Department of HR, and my contact there was gone. Donna, she's left the city and county.
Oh, really? Donna?
Well, her email bounced.
Oh,
anyways.
wow.
Yeah. So, and I had not had time to follow up with a different contact.
Oh,
Do you
okay.
want to, yeah, well, just let me know if you need me to.
Yeah.
to
So we
adjust
need to
something
find a new contact there for that piece of it. So I guess I suppose we're changing process, it probably would be worth actually entertaining a motion to adopt the standard city process. Obviously, we will have missed the window for this to be in anticipation of this fiscal year, but would be for the next.
Okay.
Unless we want to specify a different period for the actual appraisal period.
Well, I mean, I would say our next evaluation is going to be using this. Whatever we
It'd be
got
using
today.
this, right, but I guess when I say
So-
alignment with this, I believe that this was for a fiscal year,
Oh,
right? So that was, and this fiscal year would be ending in July. So it's soon. But that, in July, then we would catch it up then going forward.
Okay, so moved.
Okay? You want a second?
yeah, I'll second.
Okay. And so, then any discussion on these items? Or on the motion, commissioners? Yeah. Okay, public comment?
Thank you, Commissioners. My name is David Carey. I certainly support this idea of providing a little more structure to the process of setting goals and doing evaluations. And I think particularly, we certainly see in the election plan that no two elections are exactly the same, but conducting elections tends to be a little bit more of a stable process than building a new voting system. And I think particularly in the area of building a new voting system, an open source voting system, this will be particularly helpful. Some thoughts about some of the things you talked about. In terms of the period, July is kind of right at the 1st of July is right at the end of finishing up a canvass for a June election. Maybe even canvass isn't necessarily complete by then. And so one of the questions is, specifically for a director of elections, would you want to choose a period that gives you more time to complete an election and for the commission to evaluate the performance of that election in terms of doing an evaluation of an annual review? I can see you could probably find a way to make it work either way. Certainly the physical, doing it on a fiscal year, on the boundaries of a fiscal year, certainly has its values. What I was hearing of the discussion of the process of setting goals was I was kind of hearing the commission had set some goals and the director would suggest the goals and you kind of put them in a big bag and shuffle them around and come up with something that you have for the director. I'd encourage you to do that in a way that whatever final goals you come up with are something that are done in kind of an interactive consultation with the director, even if that's in closed session, just to not discourage him from setting up some goals for himself and maybe saying, let's do some trade-off here because I can't do everything, and getting some feedback about from the director about, yeah, you commissioners want me to do everything, and there are limits to what we can do. Another consideration is, let's see if I can remember it here. Well, those are some thoughts I had, and I encourage you to come up with something, and with anything, try it out and kind of see how it goes, and make some adjustments. Oh, the other thing was, I would encourage you. I understand the importance of maybe keeping some of the objectives that you set to be personal and not made public. But consider, under your current process, there are some criteria that you do make public that would be helpful to keep something similar.
Thank you, Mr. Carey. Any further discussion, commissioners?
Well, I did want to ask Director Ernst, do you feel like, do you have enough information about what you need to do if we were to discuss this again, if you were to bring something to the table, or
I think so.
You think so? Okay.
And then one just technical thing, we missed the opportunity, but we can make sure that it's gonna be on the next meeting agenda, right, to talk about what we follow up with, because we're approving this today.
Right.
And then we will be talking about.
As a process, and then we'll be talking about the
of it,
details,
yes.
that's right. And
So it would be agendized for next meeting?
Yes.
Okay, just wanna make sure.
Yeah, exactly. And what I would suggest is that I can be the collection point for any objectives, but the start, at least I think the baseline is the policies of the commission and the implementation of those. And that would be the essence of the objective. However, if there are other objectives that the commissioners would like included, then please send them to me and I will consolidate them. And certainly, Director Arntz, we can discuss between now and the next commission meeting. Any other discussion? Okay, we have a motion on the table to approve the process as documented by the Director of Human Resources. So we'll take the vote. Commissioner Jurdonic?
Yes.
Commissioner Joan?
Yes.
Commissioner Mogi?
Yes.
Commissioner Donaldson votes yes. With that, we will call the commission meeting to a close. Time is 8:29 p.m.